From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Egg prices in Colorado and across the nation remain stubbornly high. If you've been grocery shopping lately, you know the cost of eggs shot up 40% over the last year. Now, some experts have blamed outbreaks of avian flu, which forced farmers to cull millions of chickens and turkeys across the country. But my guest today says that while avian flu is a factor, the systems we use to produce and deliver eggs are actually the root of the problem. And he offered ideas about what a more resilient system might look like. Jack Buffington is a professor in supply chain management at the University of Denver. In a recent article, he wrote that those high egg prices are an avoidable problem, but fixing it will require the U.S. to think differently about egg production.
I am fascinated by the food industry. I've worked in food for a long period of my life. I know how sensitive it is and the problems we have. And somehow we have to get our arms around it because, egg and beef production and consumption around the world is growing. And as it grows, it creates greater challenges to the environment and to public health. I take it back to really the basics of supply chain is good process engineering, putting in good processes in place, and having a stable workforce. So I'm fascinated by it because it seems so simple, but yet seems so complicated.
All at the same time.
Right.
So for those of us who don't really know what a supply chain is, Jack, briefly explain how a supply chain works, particularly in food and agriculture.
Yes. The goal of a supply chain is to balance supply and demand across a system. So for food such as, fresh poultry and eggs and vegetables, it's a very intense supply chain because the product is perishable. So it requires very precise processes in order to get the product at a low price and at a high quality to your retail store.
Okay. So when it's perishable, that means you got to have refrigerated trucks. They need to be in the right place at the right time.
Right. The entire supply chain needs to have proper controls in place to make sure there's no contamination or damage through the entire process.
So help me picture how this impacts the price of eggs then. We know that most of the egg production in this country is concentrated among a few large egg-laying operations. That generally leads to lower egg prices, right? What is broken down in this chain over the past year?
Yeah, I like to call our supply chains efficiently broken because typically consumers get very low prices at high scale, which is what consumers want.
Sure.
And everything works out very well as long as the supply chain operates effectively and nothing causes any problem. Of course, the bird flu problem has exacerbated that. So in that case, large supply chains are at a disadvantage versus other countries like Canada where the egg production is smaller, they're more resilient, and they're more likely to be able to weather such problems.
So is part of the problem the fact that we have these super large farms? Do they just take a bigger hit when there's something like the bird flu?
Yeah, they're less resilient. You can imagine a farm where you have anywhere from 100,000 to a million hens. To be able to control any sort of virus over a farm of that size is much more difficult than in Canada, where the farms are much smaller.
I remember a lot of us felt squeezed by supply chain problems during the pandemic. We saw shortages of things like toilet paper and baby formula. How similar is the egg situation now to those times?
Well, it's interesting for someone like me who works in supply chain, there's a commonality of how they work. And so we've had a similar problem that happened during the pandemic when it came to PPE,
protective gear,
toilet paper. And then after that, we had a problem with baby formula. So there's a similar pattern of what's happening here, even though, one may be a hurricane, one may be a bird flu, and one may be some sort of production problem.
Well, you have talked about how our supply chain is actually enabling the bird flu pandemic to be much worse in the U.S. than it is in other countries. Talk about why that is.
Well, first off, the scale of our supply chains leads to a problem of transmission and mutation because of the scale of the number of birds that are involved. And so in an industrial setting like this, creates a much greater problem when it comes to the potential for transmission and potential mutation. So, our supply chains have a role when it comes to these epidemiological events.
You mentioned Canada earlier. Canada has not really seen the kind of price increases for eggs that we have here. Their production and supply chains aren't set up the same way as ours. What are they doing differently from the US, and does it keep their prices lower?
There's a bit of irony here, given the fact that the big topic in the news are tariffs. And there are tariffs in place in the egg industry in Canada. And the reason why is because their farms are smaller and the United States' farms are larger. And so when things go right, egg prices in Canada are 50% higher than they are in the United States. We've seen a flip of that. Now, egg prices have gone down since, but we've seen a flip of that where people were actually trying to bring eggs from Canada into the United States because Canadian eggs were cheaper. And so that just gives you a really interesting story of how, resiliency and scale can sometimes be in conflict with each other.
So are you saying these egg prices that we have are not very surprising?
The bird flu has not gone away. There's still a risk of bird flu becoming a problem with our food system as well as, human transmission.
Sure.
But it's out of the news cycle because egg prices are down. And I think we have to look at things, holistically in order to be able to solve them. Otherwise, we just go from one problem to the next. We need to look at our supply chains differently. We need to look at them from a value standpoint instead of a price standpoint. One concern I have with our economy is it's focused primarily on consumption, and we need a better balance between consumption and production to create value.
How feasible is it that we could actually see these systems being reinvented?
Well, what's interesting is you're starting to see a real focus on this as being important. And I think it comes down to people seeing a need for a better balance between workers and consumers. We've seen over 40 years that the United States has created an economy that really drove towards consumption, given the size of our economy relative to the rest of the world. And I think people in the country are looking at this and saying, we need better balance. And supply chains are right in the middle of that, whether you're talking about egg production or pharmaceuticals, that's a global supply chain. And I also think that Colorado is going to be a big part of it. Colorado never was a real industrial sector, but now with everything happening around the airport, it's really becoming a supply chain and manufacturing hub, which is very exciting.
Jack Buffington is a professor of supply chain management at the University of Denver. By the way, he mentioned that in Colorado, another factor in high egg prices is the state's cage-free law. Colorado and 8 other states require hens to have more floor space in egg-laying facilities and to be raised without cages. Those requirements are another part of what's driving up prices at the grocery store. We'll include a link to his recent article in our show notes and at KUNC.org. And before we get out of here, I just want to give a shout out to our broadcast listeners in Granby. KUNC's transmitter in Granby was out of commission for a bit, but is now back up and running. And we like your town, Granby friends. We're excited to be back on the air at Granby's 97 ranches, 2 ski areas, and 6 guest ranches. So from all of us at In The NoCo, thanks for your patience. That's it today for In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thanks so much for listening.